In this video, I wanted to go ahead and talk to you guys about Ripstop in uniforms. Now, when you're selecting a uniform, I've talked about this before, where uniforms are something kind of interesting to get a good selection on, because there's different materials that you can use, different patterns, obviously different camouflage patterns. The different materials that you use are really going to determine what kind of patterns you can use, because some materials take differently than others. Some fade faster, some tear easier and stuff like that. Cotton being like one of the weakest ones here on the right, it's one of the weakest ones. And then you have a cotton nylon mix here, and then a cotton polyester, so a poly cotton, a 65-35 to be exact, and here being a 50-50 nylon, 100% cotton. So these first two are actually the most common that you'll see in military BDU uniforms. Even the combat uniforms today. So when we're talking specifically about Ripstop, the first thing we got to do is go back into history and to kind of look at where it came from. It was basically used as a substitute for silk in World War II. Silk, very tightly sewn together, had pretty good tensile strength, but being low on that kind of material, they had to substitute with Ripstop. And so when they were, the idea behind Ripstop is that it'll help assist the material, like cotton, with added strength and keep it from tearing or ripping. But the name is kind of misleading, because in most experience that I have, it doesn't stop any rips. It resists it. It gives it a little more tensile strength. But in general, this stuff is not going to do very much. You're using mostly plain weave. It was seen in like a poplin weave, which is basically small fibers tightly sewn together, and they would add Ripstop on top of that. Poplin is very smooth, very lightweight, but tightly sewn, so it has its little durability there. And then, of course, you would have plain weave or twill or whatever. You typically aren't going to see twill Ripstop, because Ripstop's really only for plain weave when you've got basically symmetrical directions. So you have a pattern going this way and a pattern going this way. So as you can see, it kind of appears like a grid. It's nice and even. And Ripstop is only really good for micro tears. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get the window licker board out here, the little whiteboard, and I'm going to go ahead and kind of give you a little drawing of what I'm talking about as far as the characteristics of Ripstop. Okay, as you can see here, I've got a bit of a grid here going on, and this is going to be like the magnified image of a plain weave, right? So if you think about it, in a plain weave, you have fabrics going this direction, and then fabrics going this direction, and they're cross weaved. This would go under, this would go over, this one goes under, this one goes over, and so on and so forth for this whole thing. So it weaves pretty tightly together. Not as tight as poplin, but that's how it's woven. So under and over on every one. So basically, with Ripstop, you'll see them at general intervals. I believe the average number is 0.2 to 0.3 of an inch apart. It depends on the manufacturer. Some want them tighter than others, and maybe it even depends on the material that you're using. But I've seen them to where they're really close. Like on First Tactical's specialist pants, they're really close. They're actually, about half the distance of the Ripstop material on the uniforms I just showed you. But anyways, to kind of simulate Ripstop, I'm going to go ahead and thicken these up a little bit. And then I'm going to kind of show you how it works, and we're going to talk a little bit, Barney style or whatever. So I guess we'll have 4 in between. So it's not really that close together. It's just really to be, a reinforcement, I guess you could say, or a kind of a fail-safe. But with plain weave, you're working with tensile strength. With twill, and other materials, they got their own characteristics that kind of make it to where Ripstop isn't necessary. But that's going to be in another video that I'm going to make on this, because this is kind of interesting stuff if you actually get into it. So Ripstop is basically like, it's really only for resisting tears and rips, kind of to slow it down from being too aggressive. With a plain weave, if you think about it, with tensile strength, you've got pulling in this direction, got fibers pulling in this direction and this direction here. So then this is tensile strength. So you got complete tension all the way across. And ripstop is basically like nylon fibers or heavier fibers like polyester, maybe a very thick cotton, interwoven to give it added strength at these little intervals in between. So basically, if I was to have like a micro tear here and this was to break, and basically these fibers would have to pick up the load and you could actually start having a tear. So basically these fibers are all starting to have to increase to pick up the slack, and that's all along the line. So obviously you might start getting a rip. So along here it might start breaking. You might have this one go out and then it just becomes a chain reaction, and so yeah, it could transfer over to this one and just keep going, and that's where the ripstop kind of comes in. So when this stuff starts fraying, it's typically going to be a heavier material that isn't going to want to give as much, like you see it a lot in cotton. If it starts fraying in an area, if it starts fraying right here, ripstop will typically hold the structure together. It's not going to flex like cotton typically, so it can kind of hold it together pretty well, but it's really only for small little areas that are frayed so much, or little breaks in the material, little tears. But let's say all of this whole area right here inside this grid is torn. That is a complete compromise of the structure in this area. So the tensile strength, your ability to carry that load is gone, and you're putting all the weight on all the tension support, and basically trying to get all of these, just the ripstop to hold it. That's not what it's for. It's supposed to kind of support if you've got other assistance as well, to kind of slow it down, right? If you have big cuts, it's not going to do anything but maybe resist it. It'll act like maybe the strength of 2 or 3 of these normal weaves or whatever, depending on what it's made out of and how tightly together it is. But when you have a good tear going and you have a lot of pressure, a lot of tensile pressure going, these aren't really going to hold on to it very well. So depending on how far apart they are, what material the ripstop is actually made out of, and the material that it's supporting, ripstop can help, and then again ripstop can not help. It can basically be irrelevant. So I wouldn't exactly say that ripstop is ripstop. I think that's kind of misleading. A lot of people that don't understand it, they might think, oh yeah, well, if I get a big tear, it'll just completely stop it. That's not necessarily the case. It supports it a little bit, and it can help resist it. It'll help with the tear and rip resistance, but in general, it's only for really small areas that need support. It helps it prevent it from spreading, helping the small tears from spreading, across or across. So that's basically what ripstop is for. And these little nylon fibers or polyester fibers, thick cotton fibers, it's just a reinforcement in different areas. It's like having a redundant beam in a building that's a little bit thicker. It's not going to really make it invincible. It's just going to kind of help support it if some things go out. But if a whole, like think of these as walls. If this whole wall was to come down, these aren't going to have the strength to support this whole thing. So, if one of these were to go out, it would be able to help pick up the slack a little bit and prevent the rest of these from going out this way or whatever. It can help, but it's not going to completely stop it. It'll just resist it more or less. So anyways, let's go ahead and get back to the uniforms. Now that I've bored you all to death with the whiteboard, sorry to beat a dead horse, but I just wanted to go ahead and illustrate, how it works and stuff like that. But when it comes to these 3 patterns, just to kind of wrap up, I think that this material, if any, actually needs this the most. This one, I think, being that it's 100% cotton, I think I would rather have a ripstop rather than a twill, just because of the nature of cotton. It frays a little easier, and you can get little micro tears, or not micro tears, but you can get smaller tears and rips a lot easier, and you're going to want to stop that. typically with a twill or something like that, or even a poplin, you're going to want a ripstop on a poplin because it's basically the same as a plain weave, but it's just tighter. But things like a twill, it's pretty much on par with this, but you know, the thing about ripstop is being a plain weave, it breathes a lot easier. Poplin is just, you know, nicer on your skin, it just feels nicer. And twill, you're just able to use heavier fabrics, and it kind of has that air and just weatherproofness, not really waterproofness, but it's just a little bit thicker and prevents, you know, breathing as much. So it'll be a little bit tougher. It'll have the same strength characteristics from my experience, but it's just not going to, I would rather just have a reinforcement on the cotton uniforms. Now with 50/50 Nyko, I could go either way with a twill or a ripstop. It doesn't really hurt my feelings either way. And I don't really know about polycotton. In my experience with polycotton, I think that a ripstop is actually a pretty good idea generally, because in my limited experience with polycotton, it seems to be a very strong material anyways, and that ripstop just adds to that. It's already really strong, and added to that, it's almost invaluable. So yeah, the other thing about ripstop that is kind of a point to remember is fading. Now here's the thing, a ripstop isn't going to hurt it necessarily, but one of the characteristics of ripstop is it's very easy to spot, right? Now, when we're looking at this 100% cotton, this thing's already started to fade. This tiger stripe uniform has already started to fade and is very pronounced in the areas that it's fading, and the ripstop just pops out really well. So, yeah, that's one of the features of ripstop, is it pronounces itself really well when the fading really starts to begin. And here's the Nyko. Depending on the material, the colors will take a little bit differently. That's why you can't have you know, your favorite colors in any kind of material necessarily. There's going to be a little bit of a color variant or a pattern. Not all patterns will fit on every uniform depending on what kind of colors they want to stick with. But on this one, it's kind of showing like in the greens and in the blacks a little bit, but mostly on the areas where my gear was rubbing. And so the ripstop will be the first thing to kind of show that it's actually fading out. And then you have this, the polycotton. This thing is not showing much of any wear, and you can't really even tell unless you get really close up that this has a ripstop in it. So that's one thing about polycotton. Typically, depending on, you know, thread counts and all that other stuff, and the colors used, it's not really going to pronounce itself that much until you really start to wear on it. That's the one good thing about polycotton. So ripstop, probably a good option for pretty much any material except for maybe Nyko. I think that one, it doesn't really need that much help. I think it's already a good combination anyways. And yeah, that's just my opinion on it. And so in closing, I just wanted to give you guys my opinion on ripstop and kind of give you a little bit of that brief history. You know, it came from, you know, World War II as a substitute, and it's just kind of stuck around, you know, like a dingleberry ever since, in a good way, like a good dingleberry. So anyways, with all that said, I appreciate you guys watching. Go ahead and leave a comment down below on if you like ripstop, if you think that there's a better weave out there that kind of makes it irrelevant. Personally, for Nyko, I think that twill makes ripstop irrelevant in some ways, but depending on the application. But yeah, I'd appreciate you guys giving me a little comment down below. Like this video, share it, and subscribe. Thanks a lot for watching. You guys have a good one.